Hello everyone, my name is David Gilchrist and I'm Director of the Centre for Public Value at the University of Western Australia Business School. The Centre for Public Value and TASCOSS, or the Tasmanian Council of Social Service, have teamed up to look at cost indexation for human services in Tasmania. The concern has been for some time, as I'm sure all listeners would know, that the financial sustainability of human services organisations has been under increasing pressure. There are concerns, of course, that organisations may not survive as a result of that, but more pressingly, perhaps, is the fact that those people that rely on human services in Tasmania to be able to live their lives are also at considerable risk. In fact, they're the shock absorbers for changes in the human services system. This presentation is aimed at giving you an introduction to the indexation project itself, but also contextualising that project to make sure that we understand not only are we concerned about the indexation number and the way it's calculated, but we're concerned about how that contextualises or articulates with the human services system and how we maintain the sustainability of that system. To that extent, then, framing the discussion, our aims are to do a few things. Firstly, to let you know that we're interested in industry level sustainability, not individual organisational sustainability. We want to make sure that indexation as a contribution to that sustainability is sufficient to be able to ensure that organisations can continue to provide the services they need to provide. If they don't do that, if costs become more prohibitive or if there's not sufficient financial resource, they must start to make decisions that are going to impact the statewide service mix. So we're concerned not only to ensure indexation helps to support that industry level sustainability, but we also want to see that the service mix is not changed inappropriately. That is, that the total services provided are appropriate to the needs of the community and are not changed inappropriately to leave people high and dry without the services that they require. The other thing that I think is really important in that context then is defining service sustainability itself. When we think about sustainability in finances, we often take a commercial view, which is that organisations should survive for their own purpose or their own benefit, and that survivorship results or comes from adequate income and efficient operations. On the other hand, we're concerned at a systemic level to ensure service sustainability, which means for us that the quality, quantity, and timing of services can be maintained. We're not so interested in individual organisational sustainability, that is, that an organisation is sustainable for the organisation's sake, is not an objective of this project. Additionally, we take a systemic view and recognise that for some organisations, indexation is going to be adequate. For some organisations, it's not going to be adequate. We're concerned with the whole system, not just individual organisations. To that extent too, that when we think about indexation, we need to make sure we appreciate what indexation does and how it contributes to that sustainability, and also not to have too high an expectation about what kinds of outcomes might be related to indexation. For instance, the rule is that getting indexation right helps us in a few ways. It helps us to insulate against unexpected service failure, that is, where organisations collapse due to financial constraints and withdraw services inappropriately from the service mix. We want to insulate against this process because it costs government a lot to be able to support the recovery of those services, and of course it costs those people who rely on the services and supports to live their life. We also want to make sure that we maintain that service mix, which I mentioned previously. That is, that the service mix is not inadvertently changed as a result of poor financing and that services particularly are withdrawn from those who need them. Finally, of course, indexation helps us to manage the government's budget and out years forecasting to understand what the costs are likely to be going forward. What indexation doesn't do, though, is that it doesn't mitigate against cumulative, inaccurate, or inadequate indexation gaps. Indexation is, by definition, always catching up to expenses. It can never go beyond expenses, and it can never really forecast what those expenses and particularly the growth in them might be from year to year. And so there is going to be a gap pretty much always, and the idea is to try and get indexation as right as possible to try and reduce that gap as far as possible, and I'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. The other thing that it can't do is it can't meet significant cost increases in real time. And probably COVID's a very good example of a situation where not only were base costs increasing, but of course there were significant financial impacts on human services organisations as a result of the COVID impacts themselves. Any significant concrete cost increases like those caused by the COVID pandemic really need to be responded to via capital injections by governments. You can't rely on indexation to meet those costs. Thirdly, indexation can't mitigate the capital shortfalls resulting from government policy change. When policies change, or when processes for service delivery change, organisations must invest in order to be able to meet the challenges that they face. That includes training their staff. It might also include new IT or other tools and equipment. It might include actually moving to different service types. All of those elements require capital to be able to operate, and typically organisations don't have a lot of capital on their balance sheet, and there needs to be capital injections to be able to support that policy change. Again, I'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. The other thing that indexation doesn't do is it doesn't respond to needs or changes in needs for services. That is, increases in service requirements not covered by indexation. They need to be covered by increased funding agreements that allow those organisations to increase their outputs. Significantly, that might also mean that they have to have an increase in terms of the the capital injection required in order to be able to hire staff and to do the things they need to gear up for that increased service. So when we think about sustainability, we tend to think about it in three clear columns. The first column in this particular chart, as you can see there, is designed to allow for the system to be able to realign its funding with changes in comprehensive cost over time. I've already mentioned that indexation can't keep up with those costs. There'll always be an indexation gap because we're always looking at cost increases in history and trying to apply those in a forward-looking way. If we have, for instance, 5 yearly comprehensive tenders, then we're able to reset that indexation to zero because we should have an understanding of what the total cost of service delivery is at that tender point. We're saying 5 yearly simply because we don't want to do it too infrequently to allow the indexation gap to build up quite substantially, but equally we want to make sure that we only have tender processes on a semi-regular basis because tendering costs governments and organisations to be able to undertake. It's not a productive process as part of the delivery of services. It's an administrative process, but also we want to make sure that at the end of the day, those organisations have clarity and certainty over an extended period as to what their contracts are going to hold so that they can also make decisions about how they react to that. The second column has also been spoken about by me in this presentation, and that is that organisations are sustainable if they can maintain capacity to meet policy change and to innovate as things change within the community and the environment in which they operate. What does that mean? It means that they need capital injections to be able to ensure staff are appropriately trained, appropriately qualified, to change IT and other tools as they change over time and as technology impacts the way we might do business. We also need to see that capital injections applied to be able to allow the organisation to replace assets over time and to ensure that it continues to be able to replace itself to maintain its service capacity. Having said all of that though, our focus in terms of this presentation is very much on the sustainability element associated with the annual response to cost experience. That is the indexation model itself. The indexation model is important, as we've said before, because it informs the budget and maintains sector capacity in between that tender processes as we've suggested here, over 5 years. All of those items add up to system sustainability. So some organisations won't be able to be sustainable even if these things are met. Some organisations might be sustainable even if these things are not met. But overall, the system can't be sustainable without these three elements. So what is a cost index? That might seem like a silly question in a sense, because most people are aware of how cost indexes are applied and how they're used to be able to bolster funding from year to year in the way that we've already explained. But what we don't necessarily appreciate is that a cost index is generally calculated by reviewing a basket of goods and services that go into the delivery of a particular service, as well as the proportion of the cost of those goods and services over time. And so any cost index that applies to the human services sector must take into account not just the components of cost and how they've risen, but also the proportion of those costs as they impact that organisation. For instance, in relation to human services, it's widely known that between 70 and 75% of total costs impact those organisations arise from employment costs, because this is a very significant workforce related service industry. The other thing I'd say at this point is that the Australian Bureau of Statistics, or the ABS, also calculates various industry indexes. For instance, the Health and Social Services Industry Cost Index. And so there are sources of information that those charged with governance and governments might use to assess cost indexes and how costs have changed for this sector going forward. The other thing to be aware of is the kinds of methods that are actually used in Tasmania and also in other states and territories. In Tasmania, we are aware that a number of cost indexes are used, and we won't go into depth on how they're calculated, except to observe that generally speaking they tend to be arbitrary and they may be based on CPI. For reasons that we'll relate shortly, CPI is not really a satisfactory foundation for indexation for human services. Other states and territories use CPI and wage price index in combination generally to be able to identify what indexation might be. They use a combination of WPI and CPI in order to proxy that indexation rate that might be better calculated had we had access to data for these organisations. As you can see here, an example is that Queensland uses an indexation rate that's based on 75% of wage price index and 25% of CPI. On the other hand, South Australia has an index rate of 2.5% until 2025, a very arbitrary percentage that's been identified. Now, I mentioned before, or alluded to before, that WPI and CPI aren't really satisfactory in combination as an index proxy for human services in Tasmania or elsewhere. There's a number of reasons for that, and initially I would say one of the reasons is that WPI and CPI are based on different geographic locations. WPI on the whole state or territory, CPI on the city. But there's some more complex issues at hand as well. In this chart, you can see down the left-hand side ticks against those elements that are identified in CPI. You can see there's not many of them. The list of elements are the things that we think are really important to consider in the context of human services indexation. And indeed, we've identified those that are relevant by the green ticks on the right-hand side. There's two things that we'd say here that are really important. One is that CPI is based on a basket of goods that relates to managing and maintaining a household. So the average life expenses incurred by families. Therefore, we think that generally speaking, there isn't an application of CPI, or it's not appropriate to human services because the costs are different in human services. The other thing to remember though is that there's also an impact in terms of CPI between discretionary and non-discretionary spending. With discretionary spending, the more an item goes up in price, the more options people might seek in terms of not actually purchasing that amount. They might, for instance, substitute the good, or they might choose to save their money or spend the money on something else entirely. On the other hand, if you have non-discretionary spending, you might find that even if the cost of that good goes up, you don't make a change because you actually need to have that good in order to live your life. For instance, water and electricity are good examples, but so too is fuel, a fantastic example in terms of what it costs to be able to run a household these days. Fuel, water and electricity are also costs to human services organisations and therefore they're relevant, but they are non-discretionary spending items. What does that mean in terms of applying the CPI to indexation for human services organisations? Well, if we look at this chart, which is not really a chart trying to point out anything other than the difference between the indexation costs of discretionary expenditure and non-discretionary expenditure. In this example, the CPI line is the light blue line, second from the top. Discretionary expenditure is the orange line, and the reason that that is so low is because, of course, as the price goes up, people don't buy so much of it, and therefore manufacturers or providers of these goods and services have to be very aware of the line drawn by consumers in terms of consuming their good, and therefore the price doesn't go up. On the other hand, the very top line is the non-discretionary expenses, the items that organisations need and families need in order to live their life, and over which they don't really have a lot of choice as to whether or not they actually end up using those amounts. What does that mean? It means that CPI is a combination of these discretionary and non-discretionary items, but charities only spend, or by and large only spend, those non-discretionary items. So even though CPI has already been identified as being inappropriate to support indexation calculations for human services organisations in the state of Tasmania, at the end of the day, even CPI doesn't cover off those goods and services that are actually captured from the point of view of the sector. So it really is a poor proxy for cost increases in this sector. The other poor proxy is wage price index. And again, down the left-hand column, you can see there are two ticks in terms of the items relating to employment expenditure that are used to calculate WPI. On the other hand, under the right-hand column, under human services labour costs, we can see green ticks against all of those things that we think are important to consider in relation to the increasing costs for these organisations. WPI is not calculated to be able to estimate increased costs, and this is a real problem. It's calculated to give employers, governments and others who are planning and perhaps negotiating wage increases or looking at wage increases an idea of the trajectory of labour costs in the country. It's not designed to say categorically what those wage cost increases have been. And therefore WPI doesn't really meet the needs of the human services sector. The other reason it doesn't meet those needs is because, of course, the human services sector is a very, very low paid sector, and that has impacts too in terms of the proportion or the ability of the sector to be able to shift the needle in relation to WPI over the whole economy. Now, in making the statements that I've made in relation to indexation, we also need to be aware of or to consider evidence to the extent to which the sector is under financial difficulty, under significant financial challenge. And so another project that we're undertaking that's reviewing Tasmania's not-for-profit sector is what we call a State of the Sector report, looking at findings in relation to cost increases and other elements of the financial sustainability of the charitable sector in Tasmania between the years 2018 and 2020. Importantly, we're not comparing apples and apples here in the sense that In our indexation project, we're looking at human services organisations specifically. In this State of the Sector project, we're actually looking at information that has come from the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission for those charities that are headquartered in Tasmania, and also from the Tasmanian and Commonwealth governments. But what are some of the indications of significant sustainability challenges? First and foremost, in those years, 2018 to 2020, the aggregate surplus for those charities headquartered in Tasmania reduced by 10.5%. That is, over that whole body of organisations, the total profit was reduced by that amount. The second issue is that 54% of Tasmania's charities did not cover health CPI in 2020. So notwithstanding that health CPI helps us to understand the cost of human and other services in the health sector, these organisations weren't able to keep up even with that cost increase. Perhaps more astounding, though, was that there was an increase in income growth and service growth for these organisations. Indeed, between 2018 and 2020, Tasmania's headquarter-based organisations, charities, increased their income by $313 million. What's important is to note that that cost them $322 million to deliver. In other words, this statistic is very, very much confirming that at the end of the day, there are not the economies of scale that one might think there would be in terms of increasing the size of organisations. The pricing is so slender that there's not a margin to be able to support that. And as I said before, it cost the sector about $9 million, the sector money that had to be injected to deliver these service growth amount. Now, the service mix has likely changed as a result of that, and unfortunately we don't have a transparent understanding of the service mix because of the nature of the data that's collected or not collected in this case. And that is a real issue for governments and for human services sector organisations because they don't really know who's actually missing out at the end of the day. Of course, the equal remuneration order and wage case decisions are having a significant impact on these organisations, and that's represented in these particular findings. What may not be well known by people listening to this presentation is the fact that health and social assistance industry organisations in Tasmania contributed almost 14% to Tasmania's gross state product. That is, this sector actually contributed 14% of the positive economic growth in Tasmania, and I think that's a really important consideration to make as well, because we tend to approach funding of the sector from a fiscal perspective. That is, we're trying to always trying to reduce or look out for opportunities to reduce the amount of money that goes into the sector, when in fact we should take an economic wide view of this sector and the fact that it contributes positively to the Tasmanian economy to the tune of 14%. One statistic that came out of this project that won't be foreign to people is the fact that between 2019 and 2020, approximately 6,000 volunteers discontinued supporting the sector. Now, we know COVID caused that, but one of the key issues is that we have always noted volunteering as being a really important part of the charitable and non-profit sector in its broadest sense. But we've also noted that volunteering constitutes a potential financial solvency issue in the case where volunteers have to be withdrawn, but that organisations rely on the income generated by those volunteers or the work done by those volunteers to maintain their sustainability. In this case, COVID really helped us realise or to identify the crystallisation of this problem and the fact that it has a financial impact on organisations. Okay, so at the end of the day, what are the project steps here? I've been fairly expansive in my discussion so far about talking about sustainability, but you recall, of course, that the key part of this project is looking at the indexation model that is applied to Tasmanian human services in terms of funding increases from year to year. How are we approaching this? Well, we're collecting data from representative group of participants that we call a panel. we've actually gone and asked those people on the basis that if we can get the data from those organisations, then that data is most likely to be representative of the entire industry in Tasmania, and therefore we can extrapolate the findings across that industry. This is a big challenge, and it's a really difficult thing because, of course, most organisations don't have spare resources to be able to provide information, which we're looking for 2019, 2020 and 21. We can't collect 2022 data yet because the financial year for many not-for-profits and charities doesn't end until the 31st of December. But also we use the Australian Charities and Not-for-Profits Commission data to help us make sure that we're on the right track in terms of the data we've collected from the panel. That data for 2022 won't be available until the second half of 2023 at the earliest, and therefore we can't actually triangulate our data to make sure that we're getting it as right as we can. Therefore, we've opted for 2019, 20 and 21. We want to apply that data once it's collected and analysed to indexation models that we've identified both in terms of statistical indexation, but also to compare the outcomes of that model and current indexation arrangements that are used in Tasmania with ABS and other indexes that are identified. Our idea is to compare the indexation gaps that might exist and to be able to examine existing models to see whether there's a proxy for indexation for this particular sector that we can then apply in order to try and be as efficient and as effective as we can be. Hopefully in that process we'll arrive at a workable model which we will report. It's important to remember that we operate collaboratively. We think the involvement of governments, the sector and the broader community even is a really important aspect of this particular approach. And we also ensure that we don't have any surprises. That is, that we communicate our findings as we find them and as transparently as possible so that all parties know what the outcomes are likely to be. The final point I would make is that, as I mentioned before, indexes cost to maintain. It costs money and time for data to be collected and for that data to then be analysed and to be considered in the context of timeliness of cost increases. These costs are incurred by governments as well as the sector, and therefore for us to be as efficient and effective as possible, that index needs to be as appropriate as possible, but hopefully also a proxy that might be developed elsewhere. We do acknowledge, though, that we're looking at this much more longitudinally. That is, that while we will report, of course, on this project, we have a number of projects, including one looking at how we might be able to use technology in the future to collect data automatically. The Australian Non-Profit Standard Chart of Accounts will help us in this process, but obviously there are challenges including security and other challenges in terms of being able to gain access to people's systems to be able to download that data. But on the other side of the coin, of course, the advantages are there as well in terms of timeliness and also in terms of efficiency of collecting data and creating or being able to calculate indexation. We need certainty for decision making, and governments also need certainty for budget management. So we would hope that this project contributes to that greatly. We also acknowledge that Tasmania has established a 10-year industry plan for this particular sector, which we think is a fantastic outcome and a really important document that looks at things like reporting transparently on outcomes achieved, which is very, very laudable. One of the things, though, that we think could be included in that plan or appended to that plan would be a 5-year industry finance plan that would help sector and government to understand what the financing requirements might be and how financing will play out over the next 5 years in order to give that transparency and certainty that everyone's looking for. You'll notice that I said that the plan should be 5 years rather than 10 years, which would align with the industry plan, simply because 5 years is probably the extended length of time that you want to undertake forecasting. There is, of course, no reason why you couldn't have a 10-year industry financing plan, but it wouldn't be cast in concrete and adjustments would need to be made as you progress down that path. I guess the other element is that it'd be great for those people listening to this presentation to be able to remember and maintain context of indexation in the context of those three key pillars of sustainability that I talked about before. Finally, we are at the Centre for Public Value really keen to get feedback, to be able to answer questions, to take comments, and also to take on ideas that you may have in relation to this particular project or the broader sustainability project that we have. Our communication details are here, and we're really delighted to be able to respond to any questions or comments. Thank you so much. I hope things go well for you and your organisation, and I look forward to perhaps talking to you down the track.